thank you guys so much for joining us. We're gonna start promptly. Sorry if you had to leave the plenary early to join us, but welcome. We're super happy to have you. So we're all going to introduce ourselves. I'm Elizabeth Schoenfeld. I'm a vice chair for research at Bay State, which is University of Massachusetts, Western Mass. And full disclosure, I am the only one up here who does not have an R01. I'm also older than everyone else on this board, we think. But it's very exciting for me because I am super excited to pick everyone's brains about their experiences getting their R01s so that we can learn from them. We're basically going to ask them lots of questions, and they're going to tell us about their experiences. And I'm sure that there are lots of experiences out here too, so we really want you to jump in with questions and jump in with your own experiences. And we are going to ask you some questions about yourself after we introduce ourselves, so we're going to make you be involved as well.
Amber Sabatini, I'm an assistant professor at University of Washington. I'm a health services researcher there and have an appointment also in the School of Public Health. I got my first R01 in 2020, following on the heels of another R34 grant. Actually, all of us are sort of gotten our first R01 in the last 4 years or so it's a recent process for us.
Yeah, I'm Mark Probst. I'm from Columbia University Irving Medical Center in New York City. I'm the director of adult research there. And yeah, similar to you, I got an R01 2 years ago to study syncope.
Hi, I'm Maggie Samuels-Kalo. I'm an emergency physician and health services researcher from MGH in Boston.
Hi, team. My name is Bernard Chang. I am a vice chair of research over at Columbia University. From my research standpoint, I look at clinician health, clinician burnout, and its impact on cardiovascular health, as well as looking at post-traumatic stress, PTSD, following stroke, and heart attacks. Similar to Amber, I'd gotten my first R01 in 2018, a grant looking at PTSD after stroke. My second R01 was a similar theme to that, but now looking at clinician health and cardiovascular risk in emergency physicians, all of us. And then recently, my third R01 was looking at COVID, long COVID, and some physiological stressors looking at that.
All right, so a lot of experience up here. We want to ask questions of you and figure out who's here. Is anyone here on a K? We'll start there. So a couple of us are on Ks. Awesome. Has anyone here, or who here, I should say, has already put in an R01? Okay. All right. Yeah. All right. Excellent. Anyone here in research fellowship right now? Awesome. And residents? Do we have residents here as well? Awesome. Whole table of residents. And so who's thinking about an R01? Do we have, at some point in the future, we got people thinking about R01s. Awesome, and planning R01s. Anyone putting an R01 in the next 6 months? All right, cool, awesome.
Dr. Schoenfeld, maybe like a big question, to make sure everyone's on the same page, particularly for some of the early trainees, maybe what R01 is, or just kind of different grants and stuff.
Why don't you start with that? Tell us what an R01 is.
Yeah, sure.
What a great place to start.
So, oh, nice. Oh, fabulous. Exactly. So, if you can think of you're doing your great science and you want someone to essentially help support your science and your research. And so there are different ways to get different types of funding. And an R01 really is what I would say like the big kahuna, one of the big kahunas of funding. It usually comes from different funding agencies, federal funding agencies such as the NIH, AHRQ, et cetera. And it supports, well, I would say, a sustained program of research around a specific research topic. So it usually runs around 5 years. You have to send a progress report every year to your funder to make sure that you're meeting your milestones, and they refund it they give you another funding for each year. But it's essentially what I would say a science project in a box. It contains funding for your protected time, your academic time to do the research. It also provides a lot of funding for your staff, so hiring your research coordinators, your data analysts, getting also co-investigators. And then finally, it also apportions some funding to your facility, because where your shop is, where you're doing your research, in a way, also needs some support for you to be able to kind of keep the proverbial lights on to do the research. So it's a really, well, I would say, historically has been a real button on your kind of lapel from a research standpoint in terms of recognizing that the funder wants to invest in you, the investigator, to develop this science project and move forward?
So let's start there. I think the first thing that we'd love for everyone to give us the path you took to, and I would go with your first R01, because that may be more applicable to the rest of us. But if you want to start, Amber, tell us about the path to your first R01.
Yeah, so I think I have a really atypical path. So I did a research fellowship, and then I joined the faculty at University of Washington and got a K-12 in patient-centered outcomes research. Was the only physician in my cohort in that. It was really geared towards junior faculty development. There was a third-year optional, and I said, no, I'm going to go apply for an external K and could get 3 more years with ARC. Applied, scored in the 8th percentile, and then ARC didn't fund it that particular year. And then they took it out multiple councils and then still didn't fund it. So after that, I kind of went back to the drawing board and said, oh my gosh, this idea really isn't great for the NIH, and I didn't know if I still wanted to do it. And my mentor encouraged me to go for an R01. And so we have been working, my R01 is looking at unintended consequences of Medicare readmission policies on older adults with observation stays. And I had been doing work in that space in the commercially insured population, not even in Medicare. And he said, you have enough preliminary data, try for a small R01, which, initially was thinking like 3 years, expanded to a full project. We ended up getting it. So, and I was felt junior-ish PI when I got that, but I put a strong team around me.
Yeah, so I also had a very kind of a long road, I guess you could say, to the R01. I think it's kind of like a 10-year road for me. It was very slow, very incremental, which actually made it in a way smooth because there were no big jumps. So like Amber, I did a research fellowship right after residency. During the fellowship, my mentor at the time encouraged me to write a small NIH grant, an F32, which is a fellowship grant. It's only 2 years, $75,000. So by NIH standards, that's a very small grant. And I was lucky enough to get that. After that, I kind of got lucky again because there was this program known as the K-12 Emergency Care Research Program, which was at Mount Sinai. An institutional grant, by the way, you don't have to write. You just have to convince someone to accept you into the program. So I got into that program, and that came with funding, protected time, resources, mentorship. So it was really nice. From there, I got an individual K, which is a K-23 from NHLBI. And then you get, again, more time, more resources, salary support, protection, mentorship, et cetera. And then at the end of that K is when I applied and then reapplied for the R01. And again, I was lucky enough to get that. So again, a very slow, kind of incremental, step-by-step, roughly 10-year path.
So I think the trend that you're hearing is that this is a little bit of a long road, and my road's actually going to be even a little bit longer as we lengthen this story. So I did an emergency medicine residency and then did a combined fellowship in pediatric emergency medicine and health services research, and as part of that fellowship, did the same K-12 program that Mark described, but at Penn and CHOP, and then wrote a K-23 that got scored but not funded, and then switched institutions when I was switching to a faculty job. And then as part of that, took my K application with me, but it wasn't really a good fit at my new faculty institution. And so I resubmitted it and it didn't get funded again, and I was trying to figure out what the right move would be for that application, and ended up deciding that I really needed to switch topic areas in the setting of having switched institutions, because I was using asthma as the model system in Philadelphia, and then when I moved up to Boston, there just weren't as many asthma patients, and so it didn't really make sense to carry that project with me. And so I ultimately transitioned onto a different institutional K mechanism, the KL2 at Harvard, and did that for 2 years, and then wrote my R01 off of that mechanism, which is funded by NICHD and focused on pediatric emergency medicine disparities in general emergency departments.
So you're all getting a flavor that there's a very diverse approach to getting funding for independence. And mine, similar to the other panelists, was also a bit non-traditional. I had gotten my PhD in psychology prior to going to medical school, so had spent about 3.5 years doing my thesis, which was on neural networks and somewhat unrelated to my current area of research. When I first graduated from residency, I actually spent the first 2 to 3 years just focusing on being a clinician. I was essentially full-time clinician, just learning my chops and just focusing in on clinical care. I then, about 3 years after residency, did a New York State fellowship on stroke and got some additional research training from there. And my mentor at the time, who is not an MD, a research psychologist, had encouraged me to apply for the KL2, which is similar to the institutional K program that's available at our institution at Columbia. So from the KL2, I then had gotten some preliminary data on stroke and PTSD, and I was thinking then about, I had this conversation with my mentor about going on to a K23 versus even potentially an R21, and my mentor was essentially, you should just try for an R01. And I looked at him like he was like crazy, because I was like, I'm a very junior individual, but he's like, you have some preliminary data, you have some training, why don't you try? And so I submitted it first, got triage, which means that essentially it was not discussed at the full group, and I was completely dejected. I said, you know what, forget this, I definitely have to go back to the drawing board. But he really said, just take a step back, think about the feedback, and just go from there. And so we looked at some of the feedback from there, got some additional data, resubmitted it. It got discussed at that time, and then we then provided some additional data based on the feedback from the study section, and we were lucky enough to get it funded on a third time. And so for the time course from there, from residency graduation to the time of getting that fundable score, was about 4 years or so. But when you factor in the time that I'd done for my PhD in psychology, that you factor in about like 7 years or so. So it's kind of within the ballpark of a lot of the panelists here. So it is a bit of a long road, but it is something that is enriching, and you're also dynamically getting feedback too. So I wouldn't say it's just one long slog. There is lots of good things happening on the road to independence.
A couple of things I just want to make sure we're on the same page about. So, because we're not going to be talking about K awards, there is a whole thing on K awards in an hour that we'd be happy to have you join us. The K awards protect a lot of your time, but don't give you a lot of money. And so this sort of discussion of, do you try to go for a K or do you go for an R, was a common conversation that happened with a lot of people. And that sort of brings us to our first question. How do you know whether you have the experience to go for an R01 versus choosing to go for a K or trying to get more training or working with other people?
I can start. So I would say that of people getting R funding, I got mine earlier, and I thought I was too inexperienced, like Bernard, to go for an R01. And in reality, it was really good that my mentor pushed me. So really the key is, do you have an idea that has enough data to back it up, right? Like a scientific premise is what you're looking for. So that means either you have some level of preliminary data that supports doing that question, or there's enough body of literature out there that you can rely on to justify that question. So you have a contained project, number one, and a right question. You got some preliminary data. You have to show some track record of success as the PI, but it may not be as much as you think. If you can be strategic about filling your deficits as like a more inexperienced person with more experienced people around you. So a big difference from something like a K award, which funds you and your development, versus an R, which funds your project, is they want to know your team can do the work, right? So if your team, if you can say, our team has decades of experience in this area, and you can build that case in some way, that will kind of, make you competitive for an R01, even if you yourself maybe are less experienced as a PI. So really preliminary data, right question with enough scientific premise behind it, and you have access to a team that can support the work.
Yeah, so I think it's sometimes a tough question, to go directly for an R01 versus a K. I think a lot of it depends on how much experience and how much you've already accomplished. If you've already had prior grants, smaller grants, if you've published, several papers in one area and you've established yourself as a real, researcher, then you might be more credible as an R01 candidate at that point. I was far too junior, I think, before the K-23. I don't think I had enough publications or really a track record of funding to skip that step. So the K-23 was definitely appropriate for me. I'll also say that it's largely environmental. Not all departments are enthusiastic about K grants because they can actually cost the department money, and they can quote unquote lose money on you. I actually don't like that language. I see it as an investment, and I see clinician researchers actually as a very valuable and endangered species in medicine. But that having been said, some departments will try to kind of push you directly to an R01 to have you skip the K, because financially it's actually much more beneficial for the institution and the department because of indirect costs and things of that nature, which we may or may not have time to get into.
Yeah, I think the last thing to think about is also sort of how many years out you are. I think we have on the slide a brief note just to think about your new investigator status and then also early stage investigator, because both of those things will help you get the R01 more easily because they make your application more favorably reviewed by NIH. And so you want to be strategic about using that status to make it easier for you to get your first R01. And so people will often talk about not wanting to like waste that status on a submission for a different type of R level grant. It doesn't matter in terms of deciding between a K and an R, but it may matter in terms of your strategy about sort of which independent grant you want to go for first.
Yeah.
Are you going to take questions?
We are, but jump in. If you got a question on something we just said, we're happy.
So I get, it seems like almost all of your R's were funded on the resub, right? So I guess one of the questions that I would have is on your initial sub, what were the comments that you got back from the reviewers on the investigator section? In terms of, because most people don't get funded. Most people's reason not to get funded is not because of the investigator score, which usually tends to be pretty good.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about like what the feedback was from the reviewers.
I can take that. They knocked me a point for never having led a major grant. So I agree with you. That's been my experience that, right, because you get the overall priority score, and that's sort of divested from the other scores. So, you know, you have to write a strong grant, but like if your question is good and timely and you can convey that, it sort of like makes up for maybe like a slightly weaker team or slightly weaker environment as long as you can be reasonable in those areas. At least that's my opinion.
Yeah, I don't remember specifically what the comments were, but I think they were generally positive because I already had a track record of funding and multiple publications in that specific area, which was syncope. So I don't remember getting dinged for that. But my research strategy itself got dinged pretty harshly on the first sub in the summary statement, and I'll always remember because these are the words that we fear, a fatal flaw. And one of the reviewers said that the sample size justification had a fatal flaw, but did not mention what it was. Just wanted us to guess.
There's one thing you can't do. Just echoing some of the other panelists too as well. With my first submission, in addition to the approach, they kind of hit me pretty hard with the investigator team. And I think that particularly with your first submission, I mean, historically, your R01, they're funding, to Amber's point, they're funding the project and not specifically, and the ability of the team to be able to do that. But particularly for your first R01, there is still this idea of like, what type of mentorship will you have to help coordinate the success of these aims that you're proposing? And so there was some significant concerns on my first submission about the ability of me as like a junior investigator to be able to carry out these like, you know, very ambitious aims. And so with the resubmission, we'd actually put in this like mentorship team, even though it was not a K grant, we put in like a mentorship team structure talking about how my co-investigators were also, you know, we've had a track record as mentors, we published together, et cetera. And so we laid this path that we had this established relationship together, and they were also going to help me like be training wheels of sorts for my first larger independent grant. That's a question.
I want to bring one thing up about early stage investigator, because this was one of my colleagues had a little bit of a challenge with this. So you are an early stage investigator if you are less than 10 years from your terminal degree. So your terminal degree really matters. So I finished residency in 2009, and then I went back and did a research fellowship later and got a master's. So my terminal degree, I graduated med school back in 2005, but my terminal degree is in 2017. So that makes a difference for me. So my clock is, I have more time on that clock to still be an early stage investigator. The reason this matters for you is that you may be in a fellowship or a position where you can decide whether or not to get that master's. And if you're already 10 years out from your last terminal degree, sometimes that's a reason to fulfill the classes and actually get the master's so that you have that terminal degree and it resets your clock on an early stage investigator.
And please extend it if you've had a baby. There's all sorts of NIH rules about eligibility for extension for parents, and my sense is that people aren't taking full advantage of that, and so please make sure that you do so.
Yeah. Way in the back, and then.
Describe that last part, like the family stuff. How much time do you have?
How long can the extension?
So I actually was in the process of looking into this and then got the award funded, and so I didn't do it, but Michelle knows. Yeah.
1 year per child, and you can actually also ask for COVID extensions. You can email me. I have a lot of
And I don't believe that's maternity. I think that's paternity. So parental, you have a child. This is not about being male or female. You are taking care of a
Yeah,
child.
and we'll do anything for any type of caregiving, so you just have to justify it, but the automatic 1 year is for like the birth of a child, birth or death.
Yes. What's that?
No,
This is for the
this is
ESI
only
bump.
Yeah.
Yeah, the ESI doesn't matter for applying for the K because they're assuming if you're applying for a K, it's a training grant, and that that means you're fairly early in your investigative
So
career.
it may just be worth clarifying that early stage investigator means that your grant is scored to a different threshold, which means that you're more likely to get it even if you don't score as well. And so you really want to be in that early stage investigator bucket if at all possible. And so you want to lengthen the amount of time that you qualify as much as possible. So that's why this terminal degree thing is important, and that's why the parental leave piece is important, or the parental extension piece is important.
And it's also important to comment that ESI status only happens for R01s, right? So R21s, R03s, and K, which is a training award, don't count, and so it gives you that extra bump, and you become an early established investigator once you get, so you're independent, right? It's your first independent funding.
I was wondering if you could just comment on that to dovetail off this question, going in as a co-PI with a more senior investigator, and especially for I'm curious as like a vice chair, how you like mentor your junior researchers on that. But I'd love to hear.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So with just taking a step back, with submissions for grants, you can oftentimes be what they call the MPI, the multiple principal investigator model. I personally love them. I think they're a really great way of just team science and really leveraging complementing skill sets. I do recommend, though, to some of our early investigators for your first R1 to try to be a single PI. I think for 3 reasons. I think one thing from the standpoint, particularly for folks, if you're on like a tenure track process or from the promotion standpoint, oftentimes they do want to see that you are also a standalone scientist from that standpoint. So I think there is something to be there. And then also, just to the point, I think Dr. Schoenfeld mentioned like the ESI status, that if you get an MPI funded, you lose your ESI status. And so you really want to leverage that. I can't overemphasize enough how valuable. I mean, Dr. Brown talked to us about this years ago, but it's extraordinarily valuable in terms of making your submission competitive from that standpoint. But I think from the background logistics, from an administrative standpoint, or even from a financial standpoint, the MPI is not, it's really more of a nomenclature. There's something called like the coordinating PI or the contact PI, et cetera. But I think from the standpoint for early investigators, we really do try to encourage folks to take advantage of that ESI bump and submit your first submission as a single PI if possible.
Yes.
I was just wondering, for your first R01, what percentage effort did you put yourself as a PI, and did you have any regrets about the level at which you put it?
40%. And my mentor, who's a PhD mentor, longtime mentor, he counsels some of his junior ESIs to put them up to 50%. It depends how much staff you want and the type of research you're doing, right? If you're going to run a clinical trial and you need like a huge cadre of staff, then you're going to have less FTE. I do health services research, so my biggest expense is data and programming needs, and I'm very involved with the day-to-day research, so I took more time.
Yeah, I took 40% as well. It seems right. I guess keep in mind that you can always go up and down a little bit if you need to, or if you need to get other sources of funding, but I requested 40% and that's what was granted.
I did 30%. I also do health services research, but my study is running across sort of multiple sites and needed a bigger team of other people involved, and so that balanced their needs and my needs as well.
And similar to Amber, and Mark, I had requested for 40%. And I think that because even if your grant gets scored well, it goes to council and they say, okay, this is something that I think we're going to fund. Ultimately, they have to also make a financial decision that, does this make sense, this budget that you're proposing? But I think you can make a really strong case, particularly for your first big grant, that you will be, it would be very helpful to have a larger amount of effort devoted to that. And so I think you would have a good chance in a way of justifying the rationale for why you're putting that large amount of effort for the budget.
And I actually have a question for this. So, did you guys experience any administrative cuts on your budget? So, NIA cut me 20% across the board. So when you're budgeting your effort, your colleagues' efforts, you may want to account for that. For example, I had budgeted in time for a PhD student, which has a cost. There's tuition and there's stipend, and then when you cut it, you can't afford that person anymore. And when you shift that fund to a research scientist or someone else, then you can't your indirects, you lose out. So anyways, it's worth thinking about like making sure to budget as broadly and extra time, because you may end up having to like take down whatever time you allotted for yourself and your staff anyways.
Did anyone else want to respond to that? And then I'll go. Did you guys get cut?
Did not get cut.
I got cut in like the second year of my second, like my R01 on clinician, like psychological health. I think it was secondary too. It was during the pandemic too, in the setting of like the amount of like target enrollments was different, and so they said they cut it a little bit, but we were able to recoup it, you know,
They're
talking
like,
downstream.
take that physician.
Yeah.
Yes.
In terms of strategizing, do you have any strategy about whether you were putting in for a general program announcement or if you were going to go for an RFA?
That's a great question. Do you guys want to talk specifically about general parent announcements versus RFAs? Because I think that can be very confusing.
That's a PO question.
Or we can ask we have the illustrious Dr. Brown here. I don't want you on the spot. So usually sometimes there's this, what I would say, a generic call out for investigator-initiated submissions for your projects. And so if you go on the website for NIH or different institutes, you'll see there are specific kind of deadlines to kind of apply for that. But then occasionally there's also requests for applications where there's specific funding, a pot of funding for a specific kind of scope of idea for you kind of focus in on. I think at least for me, for my first R01, I was like worried that my specific idea was like on PTSD and just following ischemic stroke. It was kind of a bit of a kooky idea that kind of lived in different places. There were a couple RFAs similar to that that NIMH had kind of put out, but I decided ultimately going forward just like to generalize like investigator-initiated submission, partially because I thought I could tell my narrative a little bit more. I had a little more driving power in terms of my narrative, but I think it depends on your specific research question, because I think there are definitely, Ethan, to your point, some of the very timely questions with regards to specific medical conditions that would be really good fits. But I think it depends on each individual's specific question.
Yeah, having done this both ways, I would also think about whether or not those specific RFAs are likely to be renewed, because you could put a ton of work into something, and then if they don't get renewed and you don't have the opportunity to go in on a resubmit, then you may have a grant that doesn't have a home after that. But if you can find the right RFA, sometimes it can be really magical in terms of like just being a really nice home for your work. And so my first R01 was actually like recycling our HRSA grant that didn't get funded by HRSA, and then we sent it in under like the general R01 mechanism because there wasn't a good RFA for it. And then most recently there was it's not an R01, but a like UG3, UH3 mechanism that happened to be like asking for exactly the kind of work that we had been doing. And so it was like literally they had like written this program announcement for the work that my mentee had been doing. And so it happened to be this like really nice fit. And so even though it was one that was gonna sunset and we knew that we weren't gonna have a second chance at it, it was like worth a try to go after that program announcement. And so some of it is your like risk tolerance for having a grant that may not be able to be resubmitted. But you can always take that and then resubmit it under the generic one if it doesn't work for the specific program announcement.
Will you mention real quick what is a UG3 and when you should try to go for a UG3 versus going for an R01?
I think Maggie's being really, really humble, by the way. It's incredible.
No, I mean, this is like, it sounds like the punchline of a joke because it's funded by the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research, which is not necessarily the place where emergency physicians normally go for funding. But if you think about the patients that we see with dental pain, it's like the perfect model system for preventable ED visits, right? We hand them like antibiotics they don't need and opiates that they don't need, and then they come back and it's like a total challenge to our healthcare system. So the UG3 UH3 mechanism gives you a year of preparation for a large-scale clinical trial. So it's almost like an R03 and an R01 that's like built into one mechanism together. And so we're currently in the 1 year sort of ramp-up phase for a multi-site trial of interventions to screen and link people with unmet oral health needs to care to address both their dental needs and their social needs within the ED right now.
I think that's a good transition to like why go for an R01 versus R03s, R21s, and then I'll throw R34s in there as well, and we can define those briefly as we go. But anyone?
I don't think there's many institutions that use an R34. So if you have interest in mental health, NIMH uses this really cool 3-year mechanism that's an alternative to an R21 that's still supposed to be kind of exploratory, but it gives you more money and more time. So it's something to look at. But that being said, I think the biggest reason to go for an R01 is right question, enough preliminary data, which we have to address at some point here. What constitutes preliminary data, but you have some preliminary data and you can build a case that you have preliminary data, and you have access to the team, which you can pluck from other institutions. Like I've cold called COIs before that filled a specific need. And if you can put that together, and it's better to go for the R01. I think you've heard from a couple people here that we thought we were too junior, and had we just drug our feet, we would have burned out our ESI status. It's the only mechanism you get that. It's better just to submit.
Yeah, so I have a near peer mentor. His name was Jeff Glassberg at Sinai. He said, never write an R21. That's literally what he said to me. And sorry, Elizabeth, that's your plan?
I've never
Okay.
written an R21.
Okay. You know, and I'm kind of making a joke to try to get a point across. But his argument was basically, it's the same amount of work for a small fraction of the money. So why not just think big? You know, aim for the fences, or swing for the fences, rather.
Sorry, I'm an intern over. I'm a senior. My early investigation status expired long before we graduated medical school, and I'm on the CIHR. It's a very fascinating year about NIH and anyway. So a couple of questions which are sort of strategic and very naive. Is there a limit to the number of times you can apply? Because I usually advise my trainees to do that. Just get it in there, get it in a cycle. It will suck, you know, but you will get feedback, unless in your setting that is a disadvantage. And second of all, does the budget have anything to do with the quality evaluation? Are you short on it, or is it a separate category?
For the budget issue, so technically, no. The science is supposed to be reviewed completely independent of the budget, and then after the scientific review and priority scores are assigned, then they say, do you have any concerns with the budget? So like most budgets, unless they're egregious, will get approved. So in terms of your first question though, yeah, you have 2 submits, right? An initial and a resubmit, but that's on the same cycle. It doesn't mean that you can't take that same idea and resubmit. It's just, you know, depending what you're getting in terms of feedback, may mean you need to retool the idea, or, you know, it's kind of a crap shot sometimes. sometimes, like who reviews, just like when you submit to a journal. So like sometimes you just resubmit, it goes to a different study section, you can ask for that, or in a different set of reviewers, and you get a more favorable review on the same idea.
I know you wanted to talk about prelim data and crafting your study question.
Yeah, but there's.
There's also a question right
Oh,
here.
sorry. Go ahead.
I had this question specifically for you. So, so your K and your R had the same idea, and why do you think your K didn't get funded, but your R got funded? And like, how many publications did you have at the time of your R, and how many funded grants did you have?
Yeah, so totally separate ideas. Unlike Mark here, I haven't followed like a very specific condition all the way through. Like he's followed a very traditional model, right? Like you study it in your K and then you ramp it up in your R kind of thing. So totally separate ideas. I think I had about 18 publications when I went for my R. It wasn't a lot. Like I was pretty junior. But I had 3 preliminary studies that were directly related with 2 of the members of the team, like the core R01 team and our programmer had been working with us for a long time. So based on that like track record of collaboration, and a couple of those publications were in high impact journals, that's kind of how we got that through. And then my co-investigators were senior enough and had been well funded through the NIH. So
There's a range, though, and I think Amber is also being humble. 18 publications, I would go, whoa, that's a lot. That's pretty impressive. I do think that it really matters that it's within the domain of topic that you're submitting to, and extra bonus points if it involves some of the other co-investigators for your membership team, too. And so we've had some of our investigators in our team be successful with their R01s with 10 or less publications, or some of them even like 5 or 6, really well done studies. So I think there isn't a magic number per se, but there has to be some type of paper trail that you've invested the time and sweat equity into developing the science to now kind of propose this larger project.
Kind of a related question. So for those of you who had Ks, when did you start working on your first R, like during the K sequence? And then was it similar to the R that you proposed in your K application, or was it too early in your R?
It's like only 2 of us that have the full K,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I can answer that. So I intended to submit it about 2 years before the end of my K-23, and then I couldn't get it together in time for that deadline, so it got pushed back by one deadline. If I had done it, I would have rather do it for that first deadline, because I ended up having like a 3-month funding gap, which created some awkward conversations with leadership in the department. So the second part of your question is, was it the R01 idea that you proposed in my K? So it was definitely not. It was actually a significant pivot. So my K-23 was about syncope, but shared decision-making within syncope. And then the R01 is syncope, but clinical risk stratification. So still in the same disease kind of general topic area, but I had not even mentioned anything about risk stratification in the K-23.
Yes, Darmin.
I just wanted to point out a couple of things from the NIH side. First of all, there's something called a notice of interest. And this is a notice that is put out. You can just Google notice of interest emergency care, and that will give you a list of all the institutes at NIH who are interested in receiving grants in emergency medicine, Cancer Institute, and mental health, and heart, lung, and blood, and others that are less prominent. And it's really an interesting and nice way
they call it partnership, I think.
So, and when I just ordered an R01 from NIH, they immediately changed it into a new mechanism because it was a clinical trial. So just think about that. We have a lot of people who are doing health research, and just think about that as you go forward. If I want to do a clinical trial, what mechanism am I going to use? It is true that you get a lot of institutional recognition and academic promotion. Your prospects greatly increase with an R01. But if you're going to do a clinical trial, you may not actually be able to use that particular mechanism. Finally, you mentioned administrative cuts. They're horrible. And most institutes will say there's a 18 or 20% cut across the board. So if you ask for $1 million, we're going to give you 800,000. And the idea here is that we can just fund more people. But it's a silly idea, because if you're telling me this is how much money you need to do the project properly, why am I going to take this is way above my pay grade, and it's something that is there, so you should be aware of it. Now, of course, it would be entirely wrong of you to bump up your budgets to a budget that you know is negative. So you must not do that, he says. Okay? So you must not do that. But that's something that one must think about doing. So that you can, and then the good news though is clinical trials don't get that cut, because people realize in order to do the clinical trial, you need the money. So that is true, and it's very challenging when you really got a good budget and it gets cut a little bit. And finally, please remember that every institute is different, and you have people up on the panel who are funded by different institutes, and the way that something is done in one institute is not the way that it's done in another. So be very specific and make friends with your project officer.
I think over here.
Yeah, so I have two slightly nuanced questions, but I think we're kind of getting to that. One question I wanted to borrow from a later question, I guess, is how, when, and in which ways you interacted with your PO for your R01s, because you and your pay. And then the second question I have is, can you just comment on study sections and how you, if that influenced your choice? I had my first experience with a PO who said on R21, like how he didn't get reviewed well because of the wrong study section. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I would say this is a nice plug, nice transition too. So at 1 o'clock, there's going to be a session called Meet the Rainmakers. So you will get a chance to have a moderated discussion with some program officers from a number of different institutes. And I would say I had undervalued the interaction with my program, my PO, prior to submitting my first R01. And I can't tell you enough how much she was an enormous advocate and almost mentor of sorts for me. They know they're extraordinarily busy, but they also really are okay with reading like a quick AIMS page and give you like a 10,000-foot view of some of the science tier, and also some of the, I would say, the logistical aspects of strategizing for the submission and study sessions, et cetera. So I think POs are just an enormous treasure trove of knowledge and know-how of the infrastructure of the funding, as well as just the logistics. With regards to study sections, I think you can be quite strategic in the sense that there are a published list of the standing members, of the people who are in the different study sections, and it's a big acronym soup of different study sections, but you can see some of the members, and you might even see some of the folks that might overlap potentially with your content area, because one of the challenges when you're writing these grants is you're really writing it for a general educated intellectual audience, and so someone may not understand mitochondrial processing versus some health service research, et cetera. So it's one on the part of us as the applicants writing the submissions, but also trying to target potentially a study section that is kind of in sync with some of the research topic that you're looking at.
Yeah, great question.
I would just add to that. So I've had 2 Rs, 1 R01, and I had very different experiences at different institutes with my PO. So my PO at NIA was very hands-off, like hard to get a hold of, completely unresponsive, and they worked completely off pay lines. So my grant scored under pay line, and it got funded. It's kind of, whereas at NIMH, they don't have pay lines, and I found my PO had to advocate for my grant at 3 levels of
authority at NIMH between the scientific review and the council, and so her in my court really made that grant get funded, and so it also is institution dependent.
Yeah, I think of communicating with your PO kind of similar to equalizing when you're scuba diving. You want to do it early and often. And so I've been pretty lucky. I've had a series of very supportive POs all from NHLBI. And yeah, I think as soon as you have a nice first draft of your specific aims that you've circulated internally and it looks kind of sharp, reach out to the PO. They're going to help, as Bernard said, they're going to help you with a lot of different things. Not just the kind of overall study objectives, but also how to frame it, where to submit it, what mechanism, what institute, what study section. So again, early and often communication with the PO. With regards to study section, I want to make a point that might be obvious, but I think it's worth emphasizing, is that don't get it original, get it right. Meaning, don't ever write a grant de novo. I have literally never written a grant de novo, just like a white piece of paper and it's me typing. Never. It's all, my first step always is I reach out to my network, friends, colleagues. By the way, I'm going to reach out to you next. And I get the grants of the same mechanism, ideally of the same institute, potentially even from the same study section. I like to get maybe a funded grant and an unfunded grant, maybe get the summary statements as well if they're willing to share. Read all that, and then use that as kind of like a template, a model, what to do and what not to do. Because, man, writing an R01 from scratch, that's like very, very difficult. So I would not recommend it to anybody.
And at the risk of also being really obvious, you can see in an NIH reporter like which grants are similar to yours and which study section they went to. And so when I met with my PO for the first time, I was like, these are my aims and these are the study sections that like look to me on reporter like they might be a good fit. Do either of these sound like they might be a good fit to you? And she was like, well, this one seems sort of plausible and that one's a really bad idea. You know what I mean? And so having sort of done my homework gave me the opportunity to get some really helpful feedback from her that I think ultimately was like really helped in getting it funded.
I think we have time for one more question.
I wanted to ask a little bit about teams. I wanted to ask, did any of you work with people you have not previously had a track record with? If so, how did you identify them? How do you know that they're actually like a good person to work with in reality if you've never worked with them? And how did you initiate that conversation?
For my first R01, we needed someone who had expertise with accelerometer data, like Fitbits and Apple Watches, and I had not worked in that space previously, and so I had asked my mentor for some recommendations, and he didn't know any of those people specifically himself, so he kind of said, well, these people, we looked at some in the literature, we did almost like a basic Google Scholar search looking at from there, and then I cold emailed this individual. And I was like, this is not going to happen. This person's not going to write back. And they actually wrote back. And from there, it became like a natural, organic conversation. We met in person back then, and we thought we kind of built some type of relationship from there. But I think it varies. I would say first, ideally, trying to find it within your network, particularly for folks transitioning from K to R, within your mentorship circle or your colleagues, or seeing what type of individual is that person, both like kind of like on the science and also like off the record, because I think that's extraordinarily important. But I do think that if you can make your justification with your study team that you do show a track record of working with a couple of the other members, et cetera, not having worked with one individual, they're not going to penalize you. They'll actually recognize the content expertise from there, Michelle.
Yeah, I ended up working with someone that I hadn't worked with before because we needed these like specific pediatric quality measures, and he had written the paper that defined the measures, and like PEM is a really small world, and like there just like was one paper that defined the measures, and so we needed that guy. But the other advantage of it being a really small world is that we had people that we knew in common, and so we were able to leverage that network to be able to start some smaller collaborative projects before the R went in, and so we could demonstrate the beginnings of some work that we had done together, and it also gave me a sense of the fact that he was going to be like an amazing collaborator moving forward.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess I was pretty fortunate because a lot of the people on the team I had already worked with, published with. Some of them were mentors. There was only really one new person who happened to be from Canada, and I would email him, and he would email me back same day. I'd ask for a meeting, and then he'd make time for me. So that, to me, was an indicator that, hey, his work is also incredibly aligned with mine, so it kind of made sense for him. And I think, yeah, as long as there's win-win and they're really responsive and willing to make time for you, those are probably all good prognostic indicators.
So I've always plugged the gaps in my team with people that I just know, either have met through, other contacts, or in a few cases I've completely cold called them. So there's someone on my R01 team that's just very prominent in the field, and we said, hey, we'd like to work with you, and put her on as a sub. So I think it's fine to do that. You don't know how good of a collaborator, but I had my core team that I had already been working with, and I knew we were going to get the work done, and the extra person was bringing that higher level expertise and content, and so I just needed them more peripherally anyways.
So we are at time. I'm going to give everyone a chance to wrap up, but on the back table towards the door and here is a way to evaluate this session. We would really love feedback on whether this was worth your time and other questions you have. And I suspect that we should think about doing something longer on R01s, because just thinking about the budget, we could have done an hour on that. And so if that's something you would like, put it in there, and maybe next year we'll do a half-day session on Tuesday all about all these different nuances. You wanted to tell us?
Yeah, I'm going to be working on a workshop series for
Right.
people who are writing their first R01. It's ideally targeted people who are on a career development grant or equivalent. So you can email me at michelle.lynn@mountsina, Mount Sinai, spelled out, .org. And we're going to try to launch that in the next couple months, actually.
Anyone want to have last thoughts of themes? I mean, the theme I'm seeing is that you should go for it, and I should have gone for it a year ago, so now I have to go for it.
Inspirational words. I was going to say, just similarly what Dr. Schoenfeld was saying, just go for it, but also remember too that as emergency clinician scientists, we're a growing group, but we're still a really small community, and I think there's something really wonderful about that, insofar as that you're probably 1 degree of separation from knowing all of us in this room, and we really were just on the other side of this table just really, really recently. And so I think all of us, I can probably speak for this table, bring a tremendous amount of empathy, and we share a lot of your hopes and fears about this. And so please, from a specific follow-up standpoint, if you want, I can speak for myself. I'm more than happy to share the drafts of my previous submissions, the ones where I've gotten triaged, the ones that have gotten scored, et cetera, because to Mark's point, a lot of it is you don't want to recreate the wheel. Oftentimes there is a certain template that the funders like, and we want to share the love. We want to make sure, we want to get all you guys funded too, and just it only behooves our specialty to have more acute care investigators. So please, this is not just the shop talk, please reach out to us, and we're more than happy to kind of informally chat about this or follow up with this, because I know at times, particularly for some investigators at different institutions, you can finally feel like you're a solo person on this road. It might quite be kind of intimidating, but really we are a collective brain trust for all of you.